Today is the third of three classes that our speaker, Dr. Ken Sawyer from the McCormick Theological Seminary, will talk about Presbyterianism in America. First week we covered Zwingli and Calvin. Second week we covered early American Presbyterianism, and today we're going to discuss, among other things, the differentiation between denominations and the different types of Presbyterians. So thank you again for coming out. We'll start with a short prayer. Dear God, thank you for bringing us together once again to learn about the history of your church. As we learn, give us insight into how teaching of the early church fathers can help us become closer to you and better help for our fellow man. Keep our ears open so that we may hear what we need that will help us become better Christians. Amen. And now we'll have Dr. Sawyer.
Good morning. Thank you. It's so good to be with you again. I teach a course that is entitled Reading the Church Mothers and Fathers. It's a great class. The history of the church is not a boys' club. And so the recovery and the presentation of what was mentioned in today's sermon, that great cloud of witnesses, is crowded with the faithful witness and strong faith and strong doubt of women and men throughout the centuries. Glad to be with you, and also appreciative of kind words again in the service, noting the loss, celebrating the life of my close brother and colleague, David Daniels, with whom I was able to serve for 35 years. Church of God in Christ pastor, elevated to become a bishop in that increasingly global denomination. So he had a special portfolio for education, for providing educational opportunities and programs and curricula for this expanding denomination. And he was also a wonderful leader as an ecumenist, recognizing small c Catholicity of the church. My hope is that in time we can introduce the Catholicity of the church, even with a capital C. The bolder we might become and the more faithful we might be in our work and our witness. So it's good to be with you. We've got a lot to talk about today. This picture is, we had this up last week. You know, Jonathan Edwards, the great colonial theologian and philosopher, and one member of that power couple, Jonathan Edwards and Sarah Pierpont Edwards, just a remarkable literary record that they accomplished as well. Most people don't know Louisa Wolseley, Southerner, grew up in Kentucky. She was called to the ministry in a tradition that did not recognize the ministry of women. She was called, though. So like many faithful women called to ministry, she married someone who would be accepted in ministry and sought to find her vocation through her spouse's vocation. But he faltered a bit in his calling and did not understand himself to be called to ministry. What was she to do? But to answer her call faithfully. One morning, the pastor of the congregation where she participated in was ill or detained or providentially absent, and so she spoke. She preached. And that began the more public component of her faithful answer to her own calling to ministry. And the presbytery helped her. The presbytery ordained her. And when the synod forbade and deleted her name, the presbytery protected her by putting her in the category of being in transit between calls. So being in transit between calls, she was not vulnerable to the disciplinary processes by which the synod would then seek to silence her. And so that was just a temporary arrangement, 40 years, 40 years of temporary assignments, 40 years of being in transit before she was a Cumberland Presbyterian, so one of the Southern Presbyterian, one of the members of the family, Presbyterian family, but one of the organizations that emerged in the Second Great Awakening, the Great Revival that begins at Cane Ridge, and then spurs and spawns a whole group of different denominational groups, like the Disciples of Christ and the Cumberland Presbyterians. J. Gresham Machen and Gayrod Wilmore, we'll get to them in just a few minutes. We begin by talking about the challenges facing everybody from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War I. It's a difficult time, a time, though, of tremendous change, industrialization, massive immigration, the growth of critical approaches to the natural world, the rise of the natural sciences, the application of some emerging scientific methods in the emergence of modern archaeology and of biblical studies as well. The move from an understanding of the Hebrew Bible as being written by Moses, the Mosaic authorship, to an understanding of the Hebrew Bible as a mosaic of authors. It's a nice wordplay, but it's also helpful in understanding the opportunities of altering our view of what we're seen to be stable and comforting scriptures, to beginning to recognize even scriptures as a product of human communities, reflective of the anxieties and insights of their times, their authors, their communities. But that evokes a lot of anxiety, especially within religious groups. I've been kind of captivated by ancient Samaria lately. Are there any Sumerians in the room? Right. You should, when you come down to see about us at McCormick, you should first email me and we can walk over to the Institute for the Study of Ancient Civilizations, what used to be called the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. Make a great field trip. And there are lots of food trucks around there too. So it'd be a good day. Think about it as an option. There are also actual bookstores in Hyde Park. And so it's a good draw. The challenge to Christianity and to Judaism offered by the discovery of texts, Sumerian texts, like the one that tells the story of a great flood, of creation myths, of heroes like Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, incidentally, was understood to be 1/3 human and 2/3 divine. That's a good mix, isn't it? Anyway, the challenges raised by those discoveries then provoked reactions within religious communities, and I'd just like to mention three. And you're really rather familiar with the first. Roman Catholicism strengthens its understanding of institutional truth, stability, and constancy by elevating the papacy even to the point of defining the papacy as infallible. Protecting the church from the acids of modernity. that's a particular kind of reflux, I think, is the acids of modernity, but that's a different question, right? The Pentecostal traditions, holiness and Pentecostal traditions, elevate human experience in some places to a near position of infallibility, that the human experience under the power of the Spirit transcends the categories and assessment accountability structures that are found within other sources of authority, like the scriptures, like the modern day critics. The third strand that I would lift up would be the Protestant, a Protestant reaction to the challenges of modernity, immigration, industrialization, higher criticism. And that would be the elevation of the scriptures to a position of infallibility. Centered at Princeton, but with a good satellite here in Chicago as well. I mean, we covered one of the predecessors in the conflict between David Swing and Francis Patton. The elevation of the scriptures as infallible is a nice 19th century response to the crises and fears and anxieties of the 19th century. Do the scriptures need a 19th century defense? That's a good question. In what ways is a 19th century defense of the scriptures as infallible in their original autographs? Does that really adequately respond to the challenges of 19th, 20th, and then 21st century scholarship? Don't think so. But these three responses to the modern era, as we know it, of elevation of the church in its institutional form as infallible, the elevation of experience, personal or communal, as infallible, or the elevation of the scriptures as infallible, represent a way of reacting in response to the modern. There are other ways, right? There are other ways of reacting, but we will see that that among the ways that we've seen in the last 2 weeks was a way of accommodating, a way of acknowledging, a way of engaging the contemporary by conversation with the eternal. I mean, we heard this in the worship service this morning as well, of the dance of certitude and doubt, the engagement of the self and community, bringing the dilemmas of the present into an artful and hopefully generative engagement with the scriptures and with the inherited legacy traditions of the past as well. Who was it who said there's a big difference between tradition and traditionalism? I think it was Yaroslav Pelikan, the great scholar at Yale. He said, tradition is the living faith of dead people, and traditionalism is the dead faith of living people. It's a nice statement, but it's crystallized in some of the documents and the handouts that we have for today. So how to make sense of, for example, the Presbyterian assertion of essential doctrines. This is a way of reacting to the modern era. In 1892, the Presbyterian Church in the North said, we're going to view the scriptures as infallible, and we're going to require everybody who wants to be ordained must agree with that standard, that Princetonian definition and defense of the scriptures as infallible. And in 1910, the Presbyterian Church listed essential doctrines which must be a part of the ordination vows. Interesting. Now, last week, we looked at the Adopting Act of 1729, which said, yes, all of those who seek to be ordained must be united in the essential tenets of the faith. But the Adopting Act chose not to define those essential tenets, but rather said, this is something, these are somethings. All of this is part of an essential conversation that requires accuracy of scholarship, vulnerability of personality, and intimacy of conversation and negotiation at the presbytery level for the assessment of, excuse me, and endorsement of candidates for ministry. But the Presbyterians have changed then, a group of the Presbyterians in the 1890s, in the aughts, and as by 1910 then, there are some Presbyterians who said, for us to preserve what we know to be the truth, we will ask all those who wish to be ministers to sign on this list of essential tenets. Wow, this excites a great fight within the Presbyterian denominations, but there are counterparts among the Methodists, counterparts among the Episcopalians, counterparts among the Catholics as well. This leads us then to a conversation about fundamentalism. What is fundamentalism? It's a tendency as well as a distinct historical movement. It is, among other things, a movement that has its name, the fundamentalists, a movement within 20th century Protestantism, including the Presbyterians, with its own history, its own stages of development, its own spectrum of beliefs, and its own variables. Fundamentalism also, though, is a mindset found in most traditions, not just in Christianity, but with some identifiable characteristics and common typologies. Fundamentalism is varied, though. So we're going to take a look just briefly at the ways in which fundamentalism showed itself and continues to show itself within Reformed Christianity and within some parts of our modern world. I'd like to contrast two Southerners, H.L. Mencken. Are there any Menckenites in the room? Fans of his philological studies and etymological essays. Newspaperman from Baltimore, 1880 to 1956. Great secularist, great fan of Nietzsche. It was he who was one of the lead journalists at the Scopes trial in 1925 in Tennessee. It was he who said that if you traveled by train through the South, if you threw a brick out the window, chances are you'd hit a fundamentalist. He was an arrogant secularist who labeled most of the believers that he engaged with as fundamentalists. That's a problem, but it's also, he's wonderfully eminently quotable, and he's also particularly biased. Those of you who will see this latest production of Inherit the Wind will see then an elevation of the person of Clarence Darrow, personified in the character within the play, versus the defamed Presbyterian William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, also a Cumberland Presbyterian, who was for a while Secretary of State with Wilson. The trial in the 1920s is preceded by 20 years of interesting positioning, posturing, and polemical publications. That's a lot of P's, isn't it? That help to embody a number of these values and to print them in pamphlet form, in the form of a group of pamphlets that are called the Fundamentals. Has anyone ever read the Fundamentals? Ever seen them? These were discarded from the Lutheran School of Theology, so, but I'll pass around a couple of them. These were published between in the teens by the millions and distributed free of charge to every YMCA, every pastor, every college library, funded by the Koch brothers of that era, a group of oil millionaires, and presents a kind of middling conservative evangelical engagement with popular topics of the day in terms of origin, in terms of evangelism, in terms of church growth, in terms of international relations as well. The pastor of this congregation contributes an essay to the fundamentals. Professor George Robinson at McCormick Seminary contributes an essay to the fundamentals. Professor Frank Johnson from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago contributes an essay to the fundamentals. They were not excessively provocative. They were meant to articulate the possibilities of a conservative perspective that was critical of aspects of the modern era and asking questions, like many dissenting groups do, to create a space then for further agitation and formation of communities of discourse. World War I helps radicalize these movements. And after World War I, there is a period of more militant opposition and more oppositional rhetorical posturing within denominations, within publications, and within popular publications as well. So that there's a heightened place of apocalypticism and discussion of the end of the world, of the timetable of the end, which helps put a kind of sharp and militant shape to the discussion of a kind of discussion of the future that had begun in the 1860s and 1870s and had grown especially within Reformed tradition. Now, the colonial folk tended to have a view of the future, of the end times, as optimistic, as evolving, as reflective of the growing presence of Christ and the growing influence of Christ within society. But after the Civil War, voices more pessimistic, voices more fearful begin to take over and predominate in the popular conversation and to begin to show themselves in seminary curriculum, seminary faculty, and in the popular press. So the move then, but from a post-millennial perspective, expecting the gradual improvement of American and indeed global history and society, leaving that perspective and replacing it with a more pessimistic reading of cultural possibilities is a transition which takes a generation to accomplish. But by World War I, there are many who look to the events of World War I not as an aberration, not as a catastrophic contradiction of God's plan, but rather as a confirmation of God's plan, with an expectation of catastrophism as the inauguration of God's timetable for the end of the world. Does any of this sound familiar? It's the Left Behind series, right? Which is a more contemporary iteration of the same eschatological time clock. There are a number of groups who leave the Presbyterian churches in honor of this eschatological obsession. And they found very significant organizations and institutions, including Dallas Theological Seminary, including the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, and they also have a distinctly growing influence on the faculty of Moody Bible Institute here in this part of the city. It's very interesting. Up until around 1920, the number of students from Moody Bible Institute who were members here at Fourth was very large. And the involvement of members of the Board of Trustees or elders here on the Board of Trustees at Moody was also extensive too. But something happens in the 20s. This fundamentalist challenge then brings about a break, a crisis, a fight. And some of those fights are fought in the public press. Some of them are fought in the courts, the Scopes trial in the 1920s, and some of them are fought on theological faculties as well. The fundamentalists then press for these essential doctrines, and within denominations, a variety of responses occurred. Within the Presbyterian Church USA, our denomination, a group of pastors gathered in 1924, this handout, and I apologize for this black area. It's like a photocopy machine killer, isn't it? But it was the only format I could find of it, and I kind of ran out of time. So the pastors who signed the affirmation called the Auburn Affirmation, published in 1924, say that the Adopting Act of 1729 got it right. And that those who are so fearful of the modern era that they crystallize their fears in the form of essential tenets that must be agreed to in order to qualify for ordination, that they are on the wrong side of history, are on the wrong side of scholarship, and are fear-mongering rather than affirming the central truths of the gospel and the central comforts of community, confession, and of church life. So I would commend the Auburn Affirmation, which helped challenge within the Presbyterian churches to challenge this fearful initiative, which said, in order for us to defend the gospel, we must name this essential doctrine, this one, and this one. Much rather to pay attention to the central call of the gospel, which includes affirmation, but also affirms the place of ambiguity as well. A number of folk leave the Presbyterian Church, a number of denominations. If you look back at that schematic or that map of Presbyterianism, there are a number of splits in the late 20s and early 30s. Among the new denominations, which are certainly Reformed, and indeed certainly Presbyterian, is a little group called the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And some of you may be familiar with that denomination. They broke away from Princeton Seminary and founded a new seminary in Philadelphia called Westminster. That's still there, alive and well. And the denomination continues to exist. It's not really growing that much, but it's still there. And those who break away find Westminster eventually to be too compromised. So they break away again and break away again. So that, it's kind of like Roger Williams back in the colonial period when he said, I must be free of the constraints placed on me. So he left Massachusetts, was invited to leave, went to Rhode Island. He left the community that he formed there because they were too constraining. And eventually, by the end of his life, he was living alone with his wife, and they weren't talking, right? So also this question of separatism. If you say the church must be pure in order to be true, then you're going to end up continually breaking away and breaking away and breaking away. Right. The Presbyterian Church USA went through a number of splits, and that continues to today. The various breakaways that we're going to talk about in a minute have tended to be congregations that choose to disengage from the issues that this and other communities have chosen to engage. And so they delay or postpone or deny the legitimacy of the questions that are difficult, but have been difficult from the first time they were uttered. So I'd like to lift up, though, a couple of brave moments in the life of the PCUSA, this denomination. And I think the Auburn Affirmation is one of them, to say, no, we're not members of an 18th century church. And we are not beholden to a 19th century defense of the scriptures. The scriptures are too important to be defined in 19th century Princetonian terms. And those of you who were raised up in households in which the literal, infallible scripture was the standard will realize both the grace of growing up in that kind of situation and also the limitations as well. For a text that was written 2,000 years ago to have to match that standard. Peter Gomes at Harvard Memorial Church said, the scriptures are too important to be defined as infallible. The Presbyterian Church USA casts itself as a contemporary church and not a church that looks back and marches back in time. That's interesting. There are a number then of movements that I would say are illuminations of grace and risk and faithfulness. The Auburn Affirmation, one of them. A second from the 1950s is one of the handouts, which is a letter to Presbyterians written in and unanimously adopted by the General Council of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA in 1953. And it, again, the church stands against fear and against fear-mongering and against the fear that eats the soul within individuals and communities of faith. It says there are resources within the scriptures, within the communities of faith, within this tradition in which we stand, that should enable us to stand against the fear and the fear-mongering of our times. That is pointed against McCarthyism at the time. But when you get a chance to read this, you will see that it might have been written yesterday, that the fear-mongering of our own time, the eschatological catastrophism that we hear far and wide, and we would add to that the misinformation from the pulpits as well as from some politicians that require women and men, persons of faith within religious communities, to be reminded of the resources of our own tradition, of the scriptures, and of our allies within other communities of faith and faith traditions who stand in affirmation of the goodness of creation and the goodness of God's grace in the world, and against the fear and the fear-mongering represented by bad actors within our times. So I've said a lot right then, and we're stuck in the early 50s just now. Any comments here along the way? Sir. The mic, yes.
Well, I wasn't born as a linguist, and it's not my profession, but I'm going to start with the language. Communists, when they call each other back then, 100 years ago or 50 years ago, they call each other comrade. When two communists meet each other, they call each other comrade. Guess what that word today means? When you call a gay person, you call him comrade. So that's how fast the Chinese language is changing. And I'm still trying to learn the beginning of the Chinese language meaning and realizing one thing, every word, what exactly means, not only changing over time, but changing dramatically and drastically, which is also the foundation of our thinking. We think with the words. Every day I've been walking, I've been thinking with the words. What you use this word may very much different from what I use that word. So we're arguing for nothing. But I'm going to tell you this much about Taoism. I'm reading a scholar yesterday, just stumbling upon, 1700 years ago, a scripture of a Chinese Taoist. And it's like, is he redefining Taoism? No, he's telling you what God is. It's like God is all encompass. Whatever happened is God, whatever happened is good. It's like a new 7-day story, Nothing is bad. Why are you worried about so much? But God is one at the end of the day, regardless. Why you want to split? If you truly have the faith, God is one. Let's belong to one church. That's our Chinese culture. Nobody understands it.
I appreciate that very much. I think that a series on Taoism, on the Tao of like there's a recent publication, the Tao of Pu, of the stories of Pooh Bear, or the Tao of the market, or the Tao of life, or the Tao of community. That would be a good adult education series. Thank you very much for that. The way by which the 20th century is marked, I would say, are moments of faithfulness and moments of reaction. And we see within the fundamentalist traditions, in their varied and diverse ways, a series of reactive responses to the 20th century. And so also simultaneously, there are movements of affirmation and engagement and evocation as members of this century, of this time, so that faithfulness is not measured by your ability to recreate the 1800s, but rather the more difficult task, the more faithful task of engaging people and issues past and present that are pressing, that cannot be denied and must be brought up within the life of communities of faith and shown in documents of the tradition and in the actions of communities of faith as well. So I would lift up a couple of these examples. I would say in the post-war period, the movement towards reunion. In 1958, two Presbyterian denominations united, the United Presbyterian Church of North America and the Presbyterian Church USA, to form a new denomination, the United Presbyterian Church USA. And they also affirmed the inadequacy of one creedal document alone to do the work of support, resource, and encouragement. So it is out of that reunion that the Book of Confessions emerges, with its variety of confessions, and indeed a new confession as well, the Confession of 1967. I gave you a copy of that in the handouts. It's wonderfully worth reading, especially given the challenges and crises facing denominations and denominationalism today. And it's my belief that, that the process by which denominationalism is less popular now than in previous generations affords us as contemporary believers to dare to be more faithful and to live toward, to chase after the vision of the gospel presented even in the Confession of 1967. So take a look at it and its brave engagement with the issues of racism, of family formation, of personal identity, and of poverty, and of anti-Semitism. I don't think we've solved many of those since 1967. We have opportunities to press towards a view of the beloved community that may require us to pass through times of reckoning, times of argumentation, and times of reconnecting with the resources of our own tradition. I would also lift up the responses of Presbyterians in the 60s. Here's a picture of Angela Davis. not a Presbyterian, but if you scratch certain Presbyterians of a certain age, if you pinch them, they'll cry out the name Angela Davis, right? I'm going to try this. Right. Angela Davis, dissenter, radical, self-proclaimed communist, arrested and accused, and later acquitted of charges that she was accused of. But she enjoyed the support of some agencies within the Presbyterian Church to aid in her defense. And that then, again, was an occasion for great argument, great disagreement, but also some faithfulness too. Or in the support of and engagement of the second civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. I appreciate the words of Gayrod Wilmore, whose picture we had there. He said, near the center of the whirlwind of the sometimes violent, sometimes nonviolent Black revolt stirred up with frequent improbable effect was the well-heeled upper class and almost totally white United Presbyterian Church USA. I've attempted to set down here something of what I and others recall of those days when a few of us, with the blessings of God and the imprimatur and financial support of the UPC USA, took up historically conservative but ethically sensitive and unpredictably conscientious Presbyterians. I think that's a wonderful description. The historically conservative but ethically sensitive and unpredictably conscientious denomination. There are many worse descriptions of what it might mean to be a faithful person of this century. The acts of or moments of fidelity or risk or faithfulness would include then responses to the war, responses to the post-war McCarthyism, the responses to the challenges of the 60s in all of its confusion and violence, and a readiness then to look at and to incorporate contemporary issues as a part of the agenda of conscientious church life. That, as we saw in our first week, that the church for Reformed and Presbyterian folks is not a way of getting away from the world, but rather a way of engaging the world in a fruitful and hopefully faithful way. That the doors of the church are open, and that the sacraments of the church are for the equipping of the saints for engagement with the world. So another moment of fidelity and of risk is the reunion in 1983 between the Southern Church, the Presbyterian Church US, and the Northern Church, the UPC USA, that began in 1958, but is a continuation of earlier forms. Wow, in 1983 then, an effort was made, or culminates in efforts to heal the wounds that were opened in institutional form in 1861 with the outbreak of the Civil War. The reunion in 1983 then forms the denomination that we currently have, the Presbyterian Church USA, excuse me, the current form of the denomination that this congregation is a part of, and also recognizing that this denomination then had the opportunity for engagement in a variety of issues long delayed, long denied, long feared, right? And so since 1983, there have been a number of issues, gay and lesbian presence and places within the denomination, the place of funding and divestment, the role of the church in support of the state. I mean, in the 1960s when the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, good Presbyterian, took issue with the Confession of 1967, or during the Iraq War when the Secretary of Defense was an occasional attender and member of this congregation, the discussions concerning power, empire, and consequence, whether in Gaza or in Israel, in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, are also part of our continuing engagement, our continuing troubled consideration, and our continued faithful and prayerful effort to find a proper response to being contemporary Christians with a part of the truth in service to a gospel which promises wholeness, restitution, and rehabilitation. So along the way, a number of groups have pulled away from the Presbyterian Church USA. The Presbyterian Church in America pulls away in 1973. The Evangelical Presbyterian Church organizes in the 80s. The Covenant Organization of Evangelicals organizes just a couple of years ago and pulls away. And in all of them, a number of the issues taken up by the Presbyterian Church USA are put off, kicked down the road, ignored, denied for who knows how long, right? Who knows how long these other members of the Presbyterian family of denominations will be able to ignore the needs of gay and lesbians within their own congregations, or the pressing need of young people with a variety of needs and challenges that are asked to grow up in a church that is more appropriate to the 1950s than to the 21st century. So I would just say, I would wish for those other members of the Presbyterian family to flourish, and I pray God's presence and spirit with them, and also would pray for those members of those traditions who are seeking visibility, seeking a name, seeking attention to their own legitimate identity and needs, that those denominations will also be attentive to those things too. So American Presbyterianism then has moments of uniting and eras of splits, schisms, and divisions as well. We saw that in the 1740s, the 1830s, the 1930s, and our own era as well is a time of breakaway and a time of extreme localism, emphasized localism. We may pray for the renewal of the church, the revival of the church, but also pray boldly in that they may all be one, that we may be part of one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and that the contemporary consideration of these issues and the reflection on these moments of faithfulness or of fecklessness will be woven into our understanding of the ambiguities of history and of the gifts of the church that is, which is a gathering of persons who are imperfect, in need of reconciliation and rehabilitation and of forgiveness as well. So, question, please.
In the 1960s, there's readiness of the Presbyterian Church to be open to contemporary issues and people around them. Is this kind of the undergird sentiment that enabled the young lords to take over MacArthur, or what is it called? The seminary in Lincoln Park, and and the Blackstone Rangers to take over the First Presbyterian Church in Woodlawn, and for the Native Americans that were living in Chicago to come knocking on our door and saying, we need your help. You know, they kind of took over here a little bit, really wanting this church, or the Presbyterian Church maybe as a whole, to advocate for them for the housing and needs that they had. I never really thought that that was a Presbyterian thing, actually. It seems like from what you're saying, it might be.
Well, thank you for mentioning the Young Lords. They began in 1959 as a street gang, and then were recast in 1969 as a group dedicated to political engagement, political advocacy, coalition building. Spent Friday on the campus of DePaul University, the eastern point of which used to be the McCormick campus. We were there for just a few years, 120 years. And of course, neighborhoods in Chicago change, don't they? They all change. And so Humboldt Park changes, and Wicker Park changes, and Lincoln Park changes. And in the post-war period, Lincoln Park property values were collapsing. Absentee land ownership and landlordery was on the rise. And Mayor Daley, who came in 1955, 56, said, "We're going to bring change. We're going to establish suburbia in the city, like Sandburg Village, and with all of its greatness and all of its limitations as well." Lincoln Park was also a target for his redevelopment. So also is Hyde Park. If you read this wonderful book, The Making of the Second Ghetto, it's about restrictive covenants and urban renewal on the South Side. I live in Hyde Park. Our village motto is black and white, shoulder to shoulder, against the poor. Yeah. Right. That's highlights the class trouble when at the end of World War II, the displacement of the bottom quartile of the population enabled the gentrification of Hyde Park, so its current form. So also in Lincoln Park, which raises some really interesting questions: the vitality of communities, the institutional responsibilities and responses, and your question then, the receptivity of certain traditions to questions of conscience, questions of inequity, questions of asymmetry of power. And so the Young Lords in the spring of 1969 take over the academic building that had been funded by a generous gift by W. Clement Stone, one of the chief fundraisers for Richard Nixon. And the Young Lords took it over for a few days, held it for 5 days. And one of the Young Lords also left campus secretly, was secreted away, and spoke at the General Assembly in San Antonio, Obed Lopez. So your question is, among other things, what is the institution's responsibility to pressing questions of conscience and budget and choice and representation and decision-making? And I would say that that the takeover of the McCormick campus was a mixture of faithful engagement and a conflict avoidance. It helped begin the process by which McCormick left Lincoln Park, and therefore failed to benefit from the remarkable expansion or investment of within that village of Lincoln Park. And we moved down to Hyde Park at the very years in which the bottom was falling out of the steel industry. And the population of places like Woodlawn, immediately to our south, had fallen from 81,000 in the federal census of 1960 to a population of 27,000 in 1980. So it's really a good place for a seminary. Where in a broken city, where should the seminaries be? Where there are possibilities of alliances, including the alliance at First Presbyterian under John Fry, and in a succession of pastors there, faithful pastors there, and connections with the Presbyterian, and sometimes contentious conversations within the Presbytery concerning the real world consequences of people in need presenting themselves on your doorstep. This church has had some moments of great faithfulness in response to need, and has also shown some other moments of a kind of arm's length faithfulness. Say, well, this is great. We're going to serve there, we're going to serve there, we're going to serve there. And then sometimes what's happening there will also change the hearts and minds and consciousness of the people here. And from my perspective as a faculty member at McCormick, I'm continually seeing moments of faithfulness in the beginning of programs with the intent and hope that we complacent insiders on the faculty of McCormick might actually be changed by the people with whom we're working and begin to learn more effectively alongside the students that we admit. That's the model of the kind of transformative education. That's also a model for a transformative ecclesiology. And that's a model that says this denomination, these people, these persons that we know, and these issues are lively issues that will cost us and in our engagement, and that our discipleship is not free. Our discipleship is not cheap, and the grace that we are presenting and experiencing and occasionally open to transformation by it is close to the gospel and close to the needs of the people who present themselves as members and as visitors to places like this. So, is that a reasonable response? All right. So thank you very much. It's a contentious history. It's an ambiguous history. And the 20th century, we just looked at a couple of reactive moments and a couple of responsive moments. Reaction and response are different things. And the ways in which the PCUSA has struggled to respond in a faithful way has been costly. And so the promise of the gospel is for restoration and for rest and restoration and healing and rehabilitation. And places like this are places where some of those restorative and reparative graces are seen and where the struggle continues. So thank you very much.
20 years ago, John Buchanan was leading our church. I don't have this exactly right, but the church made a decision not to invest in companies that were weapons manufacturers or something that had to do with Israel. My question is, are you aware of any decision by any PCUSA or large body about the current situation around Israel and the Middle East? Any platform or belief that we have about what is right and wrong over there?
Right. There are others in the room that can speak more directly to the immediate response of the denomination calling for a ceasefire last October and early November, and the continuing conversations then that make very clear that any policy that includes the killing of children and grandmothers and non-combatants in any way, whether on October 7th or in subsequent weeks, must be named and spoken against. The denomination has been forthright in calling for ceasefire, and so how that then connects or divides the topics and the advocates is a topic that I think others in the room can speak to more directly.